everyone, and welcome to another episode of Kamika's Heavenly Journey. Today, I have a good word for you today, and I really hope that you enjoy it. Let me begin with a prayer. Lord, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, my Lord, my rock, and my redeemer. Amen. So, I came up upon the story of Nehemiah. And as I was reading through the chapter, I said, Lord, what is it that you'd want me to focus on? And immediately he brought it to my mind one of his character traits, which is compassion. Because our God is a compassionate God. So let me give you an introduction. So I will be going through the book of Nehemiah. And it begins here in chapter 1. One of his brothers came to him, came from Judah, and with some other men, he questioned them about the Jewish remnant and those that survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. And his brother answered him and said that those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. So when Nehemiah heard this, he sat down and wept. In verse 4, it says, "For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." Now, clearly, Nehemiah was deeply saddened by this news. He did not weep for, an hour, 6 hours or 12 hours. It says he mourned and prayed before the heaven for some days, a number of days. So you can tell how distraught, how just sad he was about this situation, about Jerusalem being destroyed. So he prayed, and I love this prayer, and I want to share it with you. So he starts off by saying, "O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commands, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel." So he's praying not only on behalf of himself, but also on behalf of the people of Israel. He goes on to say, "I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses." Moving on to verse 10, still he prays, "They are your servants and your people whom you redeemed by your great strength." He's referring to the Israelites. And I continue, "And your mighty hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man." So he was referring to the king, because he was in the position of cupbearer to the king. So after these days of mourning and deep sadness, he prays to God over these few days. And he says nothing to the king. Right? He went to doing his job, and while he was doing his job, the king said to him, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of the heart." Nehemiah goes on to say, "I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, 'May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?' The king said to me, 'What is it you want?' Then I prayed to the king of heaven. And I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah, where my fathers are buried, so I can rebuild it. Now, just this whole situation, he asked God to grant him favor in the king's eyes, because he knew in his heart that God was sending him to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. An absolute, an humongous task. And I'm just in awe how, without even saying a word, the king asks him, what's going on? Why you look like that? And he answers the king. And then even as he's answering the king, he's asking God, he prayed to God, and then he gives the king an answer. And then in verse 6, it says, then the king with the queen sitting beside him asked me, how long will your journey take? And when will you get back? So it pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. So already, God has already set things up for him. I mean, there was just no, the king didn't even question, if he should go no, what will he do? The king said to him, when will you get back? That's all he did. So in addition to that now, he realized that, okay, he is gaining, favor in the eyes of the king. So he continues to request of the king, if it pleases the king. Nehemiah asked the king, provide me with safe conduct until I arrive in Judah, and may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, by the temple, or for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, and I gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. So the king has given him the letters that he needs, because he knows that he's going into a place that is full of rebels, and the whole city is down. The city is basically no more, and he knows that he is going to need the letters. He's going to need the accompaniment of the kings and the army officers in order for him to do this task. And amazingly, the king agrees to it. So let me move on now. So Nehemiah, he goes to Jerusalem and he inspects the wall, which is now just a bunch of stones. And he inspects it, and it says in verse 13 that by night I went out through the valley gate toward the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem which had been broken down, and its gates which had been destroyed by fire. So just to see the situation that is at hand. Now, in verse 17 it says, you see the trouble we are in. So he has now approached, this is Nehemiah, he has now approached the officials and in Jerusalem and says to them, you see the trouble we are in? Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of God upon me and what the king had said to me. And you know what they replied? Let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. So everything now is starting to seem like, okay, this is going to happen. And I love how throughout this chapter, how Nehemiah continues to pray, because he knows that it was God who has provided him to reach this far and to take on this humongous task upon himself. And now he's starting to get some opposition. So he answers, and he answers some of them and says, "Hear us, oh." So he prays, and in this prayer again he says, "Hear us, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So now the building has started, and there are still enemies lurking around talking about how they're going to come and destroy it. And, you know, again, I'm amazed at how God is continuing to just support him in every way. Nehemiah is confident, and he's continuing to encourage the workers, despite threats to come and fight them and to stop the work of building the wall. And in verse 16, "From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor." If that isn't bad enough, now there have been complaints by the people. It says in verse 5 that now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their Jewish brothers. So there was some economic crisis in the region where, the people that couldn't pay their taxes. They were unable to pay their taxes, and what was happening is that they had to be selling their land to sell their family into slavery, their wives into slavery, and their children into slavery. So when Nehemiah heard about this, he was greatly upset. And then he had to approach the people who were doing this. And he said, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? He said, Nehemiah said, "Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and all the usury you are charging them, the 100th part of the money, grain, and new wine and oil." And the officials they said in verse 12, "We will give it back, and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say." And on top of that, Nehemiah summoned the priests and made the nobles and the officials take an oath to do what they had promised to do. As you can see, Nehemiah, despite taking on such a great task, despite getting the opposition, despite having to use half his men to take watch and guard while the other men worked, he has now stepped in on behalf of his people who were being abused and who were becoming enslaved. So he now was led to have a meeting with the nobles and the officials to say, "No, stop, this cannot continue." And it just amazes me how, during the whole, as if he wasn't under enough pressure of what he was already doing, to now step in on behalf of his people. Nehemiah, he was shown compassion by God. And now Nehemiah, is showing compassion for the people. And I think that is an excellent example for us as children of God. After all of this, the wall was completed in 52 days. In chapter 7, verse 4, it says, "Now the city was large and spacious, and there were few people in it, and the houses had not yet been rebuilt. So my God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles, the officials, and the common people for registration by families." So now they're trying to, build back the towns and, inhabit Jerusalem as it was before. As the people of Jerusalem gathered, and, they're praying, because there's a gathering now, and I love how they prayed in chapter 9, where it says, "But you are a forgiving God, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love. And then further on in verse 19, because of your great compassion, you did not abandon them in the desert. Them being the Israelites. And I thought, wow, before I went to those verses that spoke about the compassion of God for the Israelites, beginning, God says compassion. He told me that God told me that compassion is the word that I should focus on. And I just want to sum up everything. How God had compassion on Nehemiah when God saw that he was so greatly troubled as he wept for days. And he provided Nehemiah the support from the king, even as he was afraid. I can't imagine having to undertake such a huge task of building back a city and building the wall of Jerusalem. First of all, this wall was so big that it had a northern section, a southern section, western and eastern section. And even though he had opposition, even though he had to use half of his men to do the work, the other half to just stand guard and watch day and night, he still completed the task in 52 days. And not only that, he had compassion on the people of Jerusalem. And I just thought, our God is a compassionate God. And he wants us to have compassion on other people, just as how he has shown us compassion. And Nehemiah did it when he called a meeting and said, no, you can't abuse these people anymore. And I thought, wow, this entire chapter of Nehemiah just reflects how our God is a compassionate God. And I hope from me going through the story of Nehemiah, you can see how God is really so awesome and so wonderful. Who does not need compassion in a world like this today? I know I do. And I know, and it just is so wonderful and so comforting to know that we serve a God who is compassionate. And nobody can show compassion like he does. So the next time we are in a space or in a position where we're feeling alone, helpless, saddened, just at the end of our rope, just know that when we pray, we are praying to a God of compassion. We are praying to a God who shows us compassion best, that his love for us has no limits. So I hope that this is a word for somebody today, and be encouraged in this. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.